Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku lived in a world where quirks were illegal. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The first sound of the day was the hum. It was not the organic hum of a city waking up, of distant traffic, of early birds, of life. It was a synthetic, pervasive thrum that seeped through the triple-paned, acoustically sealed window of Izuku Midoriya's small apartment. It was the sound of the grid, the ever-present nervous system of Mizurufu. It was the sound of control. Izuku's eyes opened a single second before his chrono alarm chimed, a soft, synthesized tone he'd programmed himself. 6 o'clock. He sat up, the thin blanket pooling around his waist. The room was Spartan, a study in grayscale efficiency. A bed, a small desk with a data slate and a toolkit, a single chair, and a closet. There were no posters, no personal trinkets, no clutter. Clutter was a liability. Personality was a vulnerability. He moved with a practiced, deliberate economy of motion. Every step was measured, every action optimized. He was a creature of routine, because routine was safety. He stretched, feeling the familiar protest of old, poorly healed fractures in his arms and legs, a dull ache that was as much a part of him as his own heartbeat. They were ghosts of a power he could never truly exorcise. Showered and dressed in the standard gray utility jumpsuit of a Level 3 data technician for the Municipal Infrastructure Bureau, he stood before the small mirror in the bathroom. He saw a boy, though at 18 he was legally a man. A spray of dark green, unruly hair that defied any attempt to tame it, a face full of freckles that made him look younger than his years, and wide, green eyes that saw far too much. He practiced his expression, placid, slightly vacant, unremarkable. The face of a loyal registered citizen. He held it for a full minute, until the muscles memorized the passive set of his jaw, the slight downturn of his lips. Satisfied, he turned away. His breakfast was a nutrient paste, bland and efficient, squeezed from a tube. As he ate, he checked his data slate. The morning news feed scrolled by, its headlines sanitized and approved by the Quirk Suppression Bureau. New Community Purity Initiative a resounding success. Historical archives reveal pre-purge-era horrors of quirk-related disasters. Remember your duty, a quirk is a flaw. Report anomaly, save a life. Izuku's eyes flickered over the words, but his mind was elsewhere. He was cross-referencing the report on the Purity Initiative, with a back-channel data leak he'd skimmed late last night. The initiative was a series of no-knock raids in the old residential district. The success was the detention of 17 individuals, 3 of them children under 10. He closed the news feed. The nutrient paste tasted like ash in his mouth. He slung a worn satchel over his shoulder and stepped out of his apartment. The hallway was sterile white, the air smelling of ozone from the atmospheric purifiers. The hum of the grid was louder here. He walked towards the public transit station, his senses on high alert. This was the most dangerous part of his day. The walk. The city of Mizurufu was a monument to order. Sleek, silver skyscrapers clawed at a sky perpetually hazed by atmospheric regulators. Maglev trains glided silently on elevated tracks. The streets were spotless, swept clean by automated drones. And everywhere there were eyes. Security cameras swiveled on frictionless gimbals from the corners of every building. Hoverdrones, sleek black discs with a single, glowing red optic, drifted at regulated intervals, their low-frequency hum a constant reminder of their presence. And at every major intersection, a public purity scanner arch pulsed with a soft blue light. Every citizen was required to pass through one on their way to work. They scanned for contraband, unregistered electronics, and most importantly, anomalous biosignatures. The telltale energy spike of an active or even latent quirk. Izuku kept his breathing even, his heart rate steady. He had learned over years of agonizing trial and error how to suppress the storm inside him, how to bank the embers of his power so deep that they were nearly extinguished. He imagined it like a pilot light, a tiny, flickering flame in the vast, empty furnace of his being. Any more than that, and the arches would scream. As he approached the scanner, he saw a QSB patrol on the corner. There were 4 of them, clad in matte black armor that absorbed the morning light. Their faces were obscured by reflective visors, making them anonymous and imposing. They carried sonic pulse rifles and had null collars clipped to their belts. Standard patrol. Izuku's mind, a relentless engine of analysis, began to work without his conscious thought. 4-man squad. Standard formation, point, 2 flankers, 1 rear guard. Leader, likely the one with the slight gold trim on his helmet, is positioned at the rear. Best tactical overview. All carrying Model 7 sonic rifles, effective range 75 meters. Non-lethal, but capable of inducing seizures or rupturing eardrums at close range. 2 null collars each. Patrol route is predictable, they pass this intersection every 47 minutes. Their focus is on the morning commuter rush. Complacent. They don't expect trouble here. Their weak point is, he forced the thought down, his eyes on the ground. Stop it. Don't analyze. Don't plan. Just walk. Just be one of the sheep. He stepped through the purity arch. The blue light washed over him, and for a terrifying half-second, he felt a phantom itch under his skin, as if the pilot light threatened to flare. The arch remained silent. A synthesized female voice announced, Citizen 73309 IZUM, registered. Clear. Have a productive day. He didn't look at the QSB squad as he passed, but he could feel their collective gaze sweep over him and dismiss him in the same instant. He was background noise. He was safe. His workplace was a vast, open-plan office in the sub-basement of the Municipal Infrastructure Bureau. Hundreds of technicians sat in ergonomic chairs, staring at holographic data screens. The only sounds were the soft clatter of keys and the omnipresent hum. Izuku took his seat, his station identical to every other. His job was mind-numbingly dull. He was a digital janitor, running diagnostics on the city's water and power grids, clearing out corrupted data packets, and optimizing flow rates. It was work that required precision and attention to detail, but no creativity. Creativity was a cousin to deviance. Morning, Midoriya, a voice said beside him. It was Kenji Tanaka, a fellow technician with slicked back hair and an unnerving zeal for the system. Tanaka-san, Izuku mumbled, not looking up from his screen. Did you see the news this morning? Another successful purity sweep, Kenji said, his voice filled with genuine pride. My cousin's sister lives in that district. Says she can finally sleep soundly. It's amazing what the QSB does for us. Keeping the sickness from spreading, Izuku's fingers tightened on his stylus. The sickness. That's what they called it. A genetic disease, a contagious flaw in the human blueprint that led to chaos and destruction. The Great Purge, 80 years ago, had been the world's cure. Or so the history books said. They're just protecting us, Izuku said, his voice a perfect monotone. It was the correct, safe response. Exactly, Kenji beamed. Some people forget the horrors. The footage from the pre-purge, people setting whole cities on fire with a thought, toppling buildings just by screaming. We're lucky to live in an age of peace and order. Izuku nodded, his eyes fixed on the lines of code flowing across his screen. He didn't need to see the historical footage. He had his own teacher, a broken man living in hiding, whose body was a roadmap of the horrors of fighting for a different world. A man who had seen the other side of the coin, quirks used not for destruction, but for rescue. For heroism. A concept so alien to this world it was considered a dangerous myth. For the next 4 hours, Izuku worked. But his focus wasn't entirely on the water grid. He had a secondary task, one that no one else could see. Buried deep in the system's architecture were backdoors he had meticulously crafted over the past year. He wasn't a hacker in the traditional sense. He was a whisperer. He didn't break locks. He found keys that had been forgotten. Today's task was simple. He found a minor, insignificant sensor relay in the city's surveillance network, one that monitored a derelict alleyway in the industrial sector. He didn't disable it. That would trigger an alarm. Instead, he introduced a tiny, looping error into its data stream. For the next 24 hours, the sensor would report the last 60 seconds of footage over and over again. A perfect, seamless loop. A ghost in the machine. To any diagnostic sweep, it would look like a minor hardware glitch, too low priority to warrant immediate attention. But to the right people, That 60-second blind spot was a doorway. He completed the task, purged his command history, and went back to optimizing water flow. No one was the wiser. He was just the quiet boy, doing his job. The end of shift chime rang at 1700 hours. Izuka packed his satchel and joined the river of gray jumpsuit workers flowing out of the building, but instead of heading directly to the transit station, he took a detour. His route was a meandering, illogical path through the city's less trafficked corridors. He walked through service tunnels, down narrow side streets, and across pedestrian overpasses that were rarely used. He was breaking his pattern. He doubled back twice, pausing in a recessed doorway to watch the street behind him. He was clean. His destination was a forgotten corner of the old city, a place where the new, sterile architecture hadn't fully paved over the past. The buildings were made of brick and concrete, not the sleek polymer of the city center. Here, the hum of the grid was fainter, a distant annoyance rather than an oppressive presence. He stopped at a public library, a relic that mostly housed digital archives. He didn't go in. Instead, he went to the public waste receptacle next to the entrance. It was an old model, not one of the newer incinerator types. He glanced around. The street was empty save for a stray cat. He dropped his empty nutrient paste tube into the bin. It was a normal action, completely unremarkable. But his fingers, brushing the inside lip of the bin, confirmed what he was looking for. A small, almost invisible chalk mark. A circle with a line through it. Pickup received. Zone is clear. Relief, so potent it almost made his knees weak, washed through him. He turned and walked away, his pace steady. Inside his satchel, nestled at the bottom beneath his data slate, was a false bottom. And beneath that false bottom was a small, vacuum-sealed package. It contained medical supplies, not standard medkits, but specialized items you couldn't get without a QSB requisition order. High-tensile splinting material, industrial-grade burned salve, and a packet of nutrient-dense ration bars, the kind used for rapid recovery from extreme physical trauma. The kind of supplies someone would need after, for example, using a strength-enhancing quirk and shattering every bone in their arm. He thought of the coded message he'd received 2 nights ago, a flicker of static on an encrypted frequency that translated to a single, desperate request. Phoenix needs bandages. Supplies low. Phoenix was their codename for a resistance member with a fire-based quirk, one who often suffered from their own blowback. The dead drop location was a kilometer away. It was a hollowed-out brick in the back wall of an abandoned textile factory. He had made this drop 3 times before. It was always the same. He'd place the package inside, take a different route home, and check the library bin the next day for the confirmation mark. He never saw who picked it up. He never saw who he was helping. It was safer that way. They were all just ghosts, whispers in the static. He was the shepherd's quietest helper, the one who moved supplies and information, never the one who fought. He retrieved the package from his bag, his movements swift and sure in the deepening twilight. He found the loose brick, slipped the package into the cold, dark space behind it, and slid the brick back into place. It fit perfectly. Mission complete. He allowed himself a small, internal sigh of relief. This was his contribution. He couldn't fight on the front lines. He couldn't be a symbol. His quirk, the one he had inherited, was too wild, too vast, too dangerous. It was a supernova crammed into a light bulb. Every time he tried to use it with any real intent during his secret, solitary training sessions, it had broken him. The power was a roaring ocean, and he was a child with a thimble, trying to bail it out. So he did this instead. He used his mind, his meticulousness, his talent for seeing the patterns in the system. He was a cog in a machine of defiance, a small, vital piece that helped the larger whole function. It was enough. It had to be. He took a different route back towards his apartment, melting back into the evening crowds heading home. He was just another face, another gray jumpsuit. The adrenaline from the drop began to fade, replaced by the familiar, gnawing emptiness of his daily existence. He kept his head down, his eyes on the pavement. He was almost home. He was almost safe, and that's when the world went silent. It wasn't a true silence. The hum of the grid was still there, the distant whoosh of the maglevs. But the human sounds, The chatter, the footsteps, the noise of a city settling in for the evening, all ceased at once. It was a collective, indrawn breath. Izuku looked up. Halfway down the block, in the middle of a small evening market where vendors sold hydroponic vegetables and synthetic proteins, it was happening. A QSB van, a Brutalist black wedge, was parked haphazardly on the curb, its doors slid open. A squad of 6 officers, 2 more than a standard patrol, had formed a perimeter. Their sonic rifles were raised, aimed not at a hardened criminal or a rioting mob, but at a small family. A mother, a father, and a little girl who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. The girl was crying, tears tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. In the air around her, a dozen bright red apples bobbed gently, held aloft by an invisible force. Her quirk. Telekinesis. It was clumsy, untamed, the kind of accidental manifestation common in young children. She was probably scared or upset, and her power had lashed out, as natural and uncontrollable as a hiccup. Step away from the anomaly. The lead officer's voice boomed, distorted and metallic through his helmet's speaker. The subject is volatile. Please, the mother begged, her hands held up in a placating gesture. She's just a child. She doesn't know what she's doing. We were going to register her, I swear. All manifestations must be reported immediately. Your negligence has endangered the public, the officer stated, devoid of any emotion. 2 of his squad members began to advance, their movements slow and predatory. The father moved to stand in front of his daughter. Stay away from her, he growled, his body thrumming with a desperate, powerless fury. It was a fatal mistake. The lead officer raised his rifle, and a high-frequency shriek, barely audible to the human ear, pulsed through the air. The father convulsed, his hands flying to his ears as he crumpled to the ground, unconscious. The little girl screamed. The apples in the air trembled and then shot outwards, pelting the armored officers with pathetic, fleshy thuds. They didn't even flinch. Izuku stood frozen 50 meters away, part of the silent, staring crowd. Every instinct in his body screamed at him. Move. Help them. Do something. A fire ignited in his chest, a white-hot rage that he hadn't felt in years. It was the same fire he'd felt as a quirkless child, watching his friend Bakugo fall into the river. The helpless, agonizing urge to act, to throw himself into danger, consequences be damned. The pilot light inside him roared into an inferno. He could feel the power surging, a tingling, electric pressure building in his limbs. He could be over there in a second. A single leap. He could feel the pathways in his mind, the calculations for a 5% smash. It would shatter the pavement. It would send the officers flying. It would break every bone in his right arm and leg, but they would be safe. He could save them. A memory, sharp as a shard of glass, cut through the rage. The gaunt, skeletal face of Tashinori Yagi, his sunken eyes burning with a desperate light. This power, my boy, it is not a tool for your anger, it is a torch to be passed. You cannot be a symbol if you are a martyr. You cannot save anyone if you are dead or collared. You must be smarter. You must survive. His fists were clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. His teeth were grinding together. He was trembling, a violent, full-body tremor. He was a bomb, and the countdown had reached 1. One of the advancing officers reached the crying girl. He was gentle, his movements disarmingly slow. He knelt down. It's okay, the metallic voice said, a hollow attempt at comfort. We're just going to help you. We have a special necklace for you. He held up the null collar. It was a sleek, silver band. Izuku knew what it did. It didn't just suppress a quirk. It burrowed into the user's nervous system, delivering painful biofeedback whenever their unique energy signature began to flare. It was a collar of pain, a tool of conditioning. A leash. The mother sobbed, a raw, animal sound of pure despair. The officer clipped the collar around the little girl's neck. It clicked shut. The floating apples dropped to the ground, rolling into the gutters. The girl's tears continued, but the air around her was still. The anomaly was contained. The officers pulled the mother to her feet and slung the unconscious father over one of their shoulders. They guided the family into the back of the van. The doors slid shut with a pneumatic hiss. The crowd watched. No one spoke. No one intervened. Izuku saw their faces. Some were fearful, their eyes wide with the terror of what they had just witnessed. But others were nodding. He heard a man next to him mutter, "Disgraceful. Should have controlled their offspring." An older woman sniffed. "Better for the girl, really. To be cured before she hurts someone." The propaganda had worked. The fear was so deeply ingrained that they saw a child's rescue as her damnation, and her damnation as a public service. The QSB van pulled away from the curb and disappeared down the street. The spell was broken. The crowd began to move again, their footsteps quickening. They wanted to be away from this place. They wanted to forget what they had seen, but Izuku couldn't move. He stood rooted to the spot, the rage inside him curdling into something cold and heavy, like a block of ice in his stomach. The fire was gone, replaced by a chilling, absolute certainty. Tashinori was right. He had to be smarter. He had to survive. But this was not survival. This was a slow death. This quiet, orderly world they lived in was a cage, and they were rewarding the ones who helped lock the doors. He finally forced his legs to move, his body on autopilot. He walked the rest of the way home in a daze. The city lights seemed dimmer, the hum of the grid more malevolent. The faces of the passers-by were blank masks. He felt utterly, completely alone. He reached his apartment, the only place he was truly safe, the only place he could let the mask drop. He fumbled with the lock, his hands still shaking. The door hissed shut behind him, plunging him into the familiar, soundproofed silence. He didn't turn on the lights. He stood in the dark, his back pressed against the door. He could still see the little girl's face. He could still hear the click of the null collar. A quirk is a flaw. Report anomaly, save a life. The sickness, the words echoed in his head, a venomous chorus. The rage he had suppressed on the street came roaring back, but this time there was no logic, no training, no ghost of his mentor to hold it in check. There was only the image of a crying child and a world that applauded her punishment. A guttural sound, half sob, half scream, tore itself from his throat. He slammed his fist against the wall, but that wasn't enough. The pressure inside him was too great. The dam had to break. He squeezed his eyes shut and clenched his right fist at his side, focusing all his pain, all his fury, all his helpless despair into that single point. For a split second, nothing happened. Then it began. A sound like a million cicadas screaming at once filled his ears. Green static, shot through with brilliant white lightning, erupted around his hand. It was not the gentle pilot light. It was a rogue star being born in his fist. The air crackled with ozone, and the power, raw and untamed, felt like it was tearing his arm from its socket. He could feel his bones groaning under the strain, the muscles shredding themselves. The surge was uncontrolled, violent, and lasted only for an instant. But it was enough. The small water glass sitting on his desk, 3 meters away, exploded. It didn't just shatter, it vaporized into a fine crystal dust, the shockwave from its destruction rattling the pencils in their holder. The light died. The sound vanished. Izuku gasped, falling to his knees. His arm hung limp and useless at his side, throbbing with an agony that was terrifyingly familiar. He cradled it with his good hand, his breath coming in ragged pants. The room was dark again, silent save for his own frantic heartbeat. He stared at his trembling hand, the source of the cataclysmic energy. It looked so normal. So harmless. He was not just a quiet boy on the grid. He was not just a data technician. He was not just a whisper in the resistance. He was Izuku Midoriya. He was a living anomaly. And in a world that had outlawed his very existence, he was hiding an inheritance of power so great it could shatter the cage, or tear him apart in the process. Looking at the shimmering dust that was once a glass, he realized with chilling clarity that the line between the two was thinner than he had ever imagined. Agony was the price. It always was. It bloomed in his right arm, a nauseating, white-hot flower of pain that radiated from his knuckles all the way to his shoulder. Izuku lay curled on the cold floor of his apartment, a strangled gasp hissing between his clenched teeth. The darkness of the room was absolute, but the phantom image of green lightning was seared onto the backs of his eyelids. His arm was a ruin. He knew the feeling intimately, The sickening grate of fractured bone, the deep, thrumming ache of torn muscle and ruptured capillaries. A 1% burst, maybe less, and entirely uncontrolled. This was the cost of a single moment of emotional incontinence. He bit down on a wave of nausea, forcing himself to breathe. In, out. Slow, measured breaths, just as Toshinori had taught him. Control the pain. Don't let it control you. The memory of that voice, thin and reedy but laden with an impossible weight, was a lifeline in the churning sea of his own failure. He slowly, painstakingly pushed himself up with his left hand, his ruined right arm held protectively against his chest. The fine, shimmering dust that had been a water glass coated his desk, a glittering testament to his catastrophic loss of control. He had been so careful for so long, a monk practicing a faith of suppression, and in one moment of furious grief, he had desecrated his own temple. The shame was as sharp as the pain. He had let the sight of that little girl, the casual cruelty of the QSB, and the public's placid acceptance shatter his discipline. He wasn't a resistance operative. He was a volatile element, a liability. A child playing with a star. How had it come to this? How had he, Izuku Midoriya, the quirkless, invisible boy, become the secret inheritor of a power that could level a city block or shatter his own body with a careless thought? The pain was a key, unlocking a door in his memory. The dark apartment dissolved, and he was 16 again, standing in the pouring rain, soaked to the bone and shivering not from the cold, but from a terrifying, exhilarating hope. For years ago, the rain fell in relentless sheets, turning the neon signs of the undercity into blurry, bleeding watercolors. It was a district the QSB patrols didn't sweep with their usual fastidiousness, a place of crumbling facades and flickering streetlights where the grid's hum was a distant, fractured drone. 16-year-old Izuku was running, his worn synth leather shoes splashing through ankle-deep puddles. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the rhythm of the downpour. He wasn't running from anything. He was running to something. He had been tracking the whispers for weeks. Not the resistance whispers he would later learn to navigate, but the hushed, fearful rumors on the fringe networks. Talk of a ghost, a specter that haunted the forgotten sectors of the city. A man who moved with impossible speed, a wraith who disrupted QSB patrols just long enough for their targets to slip away. They called him the Glitch, a phantom in the system. Izuku, with his obsessive analytical mind, had spent every spare moment piecing together the sightings, cross-referencing them with patrol schedules and surveillance blind spots. He had found a pattern. A hunting ground. He rounded a corner into a narrow alley, the stench of overflowing dumpsters and damp concrete thick in the air. And he saw it. A QSB suppression drone, a far more menacing model than the standard hovering discs, was cornering an old woman. This one was spider-like, with 4 articulated legs and a powerful sonic emitter mounted on its chassis. The old woman had been caught trying to use a minor quirk, mending a tear in her grandson's coat with glowing, ethereal threads. The drone had her pinned against a graffiti-scarred wall, its optic glowing a predatory red, its emitter whining as it charged. Izuku didn't think. The same reckless, self-destructive instinct that had driven him to face the sludge villain for Bakugo's sake all those years ago took over. He was quirkless. He was small. He had nothing but his wits and his desperation. He unslung his heavy satchel, filled with textbooks and a clunky, outdated data slate. With a scream that was lost in the sound of the rain, he hurled it with all his might. The bag spun through the air and struck the drone's primary optic with a surprisingly loud crack. The machine staggered, its sonic whine cutting off as its targeting system recalibrated. Its red eye swiveled from the terrified old woman to fixate on him. It was a momentary distraction, but it was enough. The old woman scrambled away, disappearing into the shadows. The drone took a step towards Izuku, its metal legs clicking on the wet pavement. He was frozen, the reality of his insane action crashing down on him. He was going to be arrested. He was going to be sent to a rehabilitation center. His life was over. Then, a blur. Something moved in the alley's deep shadows. It was a flash of yellow and blue, so fast it was more an afterimage than a presence. There was a sickening crunch of metal, and the drone crumpled inward as if struck by a freight train. It collapsed into a heap of sparking, twisted parts, its red eye flickering and dying. Izuku stared, his mouth agape. Standing over the mechanical wreckage was a man. He was impossibly tall, but he looked like a skeleton draped in a scarecrow's clothes. A ridiculously oversized, tattered yellow raincoat hung from his bony frame, the hood drawn low over his face. What little skin was visible was sallow and stretched tight over his cheekbones. He was leaning heavily against the wall, his breath coming in shallow, ragged wheezes that turned into a deep, wet cough. He coughed into a handkerchief, and when he pulled it away, Izuku saw a dark stain of red. This was the glitch. This walking corpse? The man looked up, and Izuku's breath hitched. In the depths of that shadowed hood, two eyes burned with a ferocious, brilliant blue light. They were eyes that held an impossible history of triumph and sorrow. They were the eyes of a dying star. That was a foolish thing to do, boy, the man rasped, his voice a ghost of a former baritone. A brave, foolish, and utterly idiotic thing to do. It was going to hurt her. Izuku stammered, unable to look away from those piercing eyes. The man took a stumbling step forward, emerging more fully into the dim light. Izuku could see him better now. The sunken cheeks, the gaunt frame, it was like looking at a famine victim. But there was something about his posture, even hunched in pain, that hinted at a forgotten power, like a ruined cathedral that still remembered what it was to be magnificent. "You're quirkless," the man stated. It wasn't a question. "I can sense it. The quieting you. So I ask again. Why? I don't know," Izuku said, the honest answer falling from his lips before he could stop it. "My legs just moved. It was the right thing to do." A strange expression crossed the man's face. It was a flicker of something Izuku couldn't name, astonishment, sorrow, and a sliver of something that looked like desperate hope. The man coughed again, a racking spasm that bent him double. "The reports, they called you a ghost, a glitch," Izuku said, finding his voice. "But you're him, aren't you? From the old stories. The ones they erased. The symbol of peace." The man flinched, a genuine, painful recall. He looked around the alley, his burning eyes scanning the rooftops with a paranoid intensity that spoke of years on the run. "Don't say that name. That man is dead. He died with the old world." "But you saved me," Izuku insisted. "You saved that woman. That's what a hero does." "A hero?" The man let out a short, bitter laugh that turned into another coughing fit. "Look at me, boy. I am a relic. A ghost haunted by the embers of a fire that burned out long ago. I am a fugitive, hunted by the very people I once swore to protect. Heroism is a fairy tale the QSB stamped out for a reason." He looked Izuku up and down, a slow, searching gaze that felt like it was peeling back layers of his soul. "But you still believe in it, don't you? Even with no power, no reason to, you moved. You have the heart of a hero, even in a world that has outlawed the very concept." The man staggered closer, and Izuku could smell the antiseptic scent of old bandages and the metallic tang of blood. He reached out a trembling, skeletal hand and placed it on Izuku's shoulder. His touch was surprisingly firm. "I am dying," the man said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The last embers of my power are guttering out." It was a torch, meant to be passed from one generation to the next, a secret fire to keep hope alive in the dark. But the line is broken. I am the last. He paused, his gaze intensifying. Or I was. He looked at Izuku, and a desperate, reckless idea began to form in those brilliant blue eyes. "I have been searching. Not for a successor with a powerful quirk. The QSB would find them in a heartbeat. I've been searching for a vessel. A worthy heart. A quiet place to hide a fire until the world is ready for the dawn." He coughed, and his body seemed to shrink. "Boy, what is your name?" "Izuku. Izuku Midoriya. Izuku Midoriya," the man repeated, the name a strange weight on his tongue. "You have a choice. You can go back to your quiet, quirkless life. You can keep your head down and survive in this gray world they have built. Or, you can take up my burden. You can inherit a power that will paint a target on your back for the rest of your life. It will break your body. It will isolate you. It is a curse as much as it is a gift. But it is also the only hope this world has left." He pulled a single, long strand of his blonde hair from his head. It seemed to glow with a faint inner light in the gloom of the alley. "You can be a hero, Izuku Midoriya," the man whispered, his voice cracking with a lifetime of pain and conviction. "You can inherit one for all. But to do it, you have to eat this." Izuku gasped, the memory receding as the sharp pain in his arm brought him crashing back to the present. He was still on the floor of his apartment. His splinting kit was across the room, on the shelf above his toolkit. Gritting his teeth, he crawled across the floor, dragging his useless arm. The simple act was an ordeal. This was the curse Tashinori, All Might, had spoken of. This agony was the price of his inheritance. He had spent the first 2 years after that fateful meeting learning to control the tidal wave of power now housed in his body. His training ground was a derelict sub-basement of the transit system, a forgotten space he'd found on an old municipal schematic. It was soundproofed by meters of earth and concrete. His first attempt at a 5% smash had shattered both his legs and his right arm simultaneously. He'd had to crawl for 2 kilometers through service tunnels to get back to his apartment, the pain so intense he'd blacked out twice. He had spent a month bedridden, setting his own bones with scavenged medical supplies and living off nutrient paste, telling the MIB he had contracted a severe respiratory virus and was under quarantine. He learned the hard way. He learned that One for All was not a faucet he could turn on and off. It was a live electrical wire, and touching it without insulation was suicide. So he started smaller. He stopped trying to punch things. He started trying to nudge them. He would spend hours in that basement, focusing the power into a single finger. Not a flick, not an attack, but just a presence. He tried to channel an infinitesimal fraction, 0.01%, just to create a tiny puff of air. More often than not, the feedback would dislocate his finger with an audible pop. But slowly, painstakingly, he learned. He learned to create a flick of compressed air powerful enough to trip a pursuing officer without looking like a quirk. He learned to channel a nudge of electromagnetic energy to make a security camera stutter for a crucial second. He learned to leak just enough energy to short out a data slate from a few feet away. These weren't the actions of a hero. They were the tricks of a spy, a saboteur. He had taken the most powerful quirk in history, the power of the symbol of peace, and turned it into a set of lockpicks. The irony was a constant, bitter taste in his mouth. But it kept him alive. It let him help in small ways. It was, he told himself, the smarter way to fight, until tonight, when his heart had overridden his head. He finally reached the shelf and pulled down the kit with his good hand. Working one-handed, he retrieved a roll of high-tensile splinting material and a syringe of localized anesthetic he'd liberated from a QSB medical shipment manifest. The needle was self-administering, but it still took him 3 clumsy attempts to press it to his bicep and trigger it. A blessed numbness began to creep down his arm, dulling the razor's edge of the pain. With grunts of exertion, he set the bones as best he could, his own analytical mind coldly assessing the damage. A compound fracture in the ulna, a hairline fracture in the radius, not as bad as it could have been. He wrapped the arm tightly, creating a rigid, functional cast. As he finished, his eyes fell upon his true communication device. It wasn't his data slate. It was a relic, an old, battery-powered shortwave radio he had shielded with lead foil and modified himself. No digital signature, no network connection. Untraceable. He felt a sudden cold dread. He was supposed to monitor the designated frequency at 2100 hours every night for coded messages. He glanced at his chrono. 22:14. He had been so lost in his pain and memories that he had missed the window. Cursing himself, he scrambled to the radio and powered it on. The speaker hissed with static. He twisted the dial, his fingers clumsy. He hoped it was a quiet night, that he hadn't missed anything important. He tuned it to the pre-agreed frequency, a place of near-total silence on the band. He didn't hear a voice. He heard a faint, repeating signal. A series of numbers, read by a digitized, monotone voice. 9. 21. 4. 18. 7. 15. 8. It was a contingency broadcast. It meant an agent had missed a check-in and was presumed compromised. He grabbed a pen in his notebook, the one with the real analysis in it, kept under a loose floorboard, and began to scribble down the numbers. It was a simple substitution cipher, keyed to the day's date. His blood ran cold as he decoded the message. INGENIUMCAPTURED. Ingenium. The codename belonged to Tensei, a key figure in the fledgling resistance. Ingenium wasn't a fighter. He was a courier, blessed with a subtle quirk that let him move through the city with incredible speed and efficiency, delivering messages and supplies. He was a vital artery for the entire underground network in Mizurufu. And he'd been caught. A second set of numbers followed. Izuku's hand shook as he transcribed them. They weren't a message. They were coordinates. The location of QSB Regional Rehabilitation Center 07. A black site. A place people went into but never came out of. It was a desperate plea for help. A Hail Mary. His own pain, his own failure, was instantly forgotten. Ingenium was captured. If the QSB broke him, and they would, the entire resistance network could unravel. Dozens of people, the people Izuku supplied, the people he created blind spots for, would be exposed. He stood up, his mind racing, the analytical engine kicking into high gear. Rehabilitation Center 07. He knew it by reputation. It was a fortress on the industrial outskirts of the city. High walls, electrified fences, bioscanners, drone patrols, and a full platoon of elite QSB guards. An assault was suicide, but the message wasn't a request for an assault. It was a plea. A rescue. That meant stealth. Infiltration. Extraction. It was impossible. And yet, he was already pulling on a dark, hooded sweatshirt over his jumpsuit. He was checking the contents of his satchel, his toolkit, a spool of high-tensile wire, a multi-spectrum scanner he'd built from scrap. His new splint was cumbersome, but the anesthetic held the pain at bay. He wouldn't be able to use his right arm for anything, let alone one for all. He had to go. Not to fight. Not to be a hero. He just had to scout. To gather information. To see if there was a flaw in the fortress, a crack he could exploit. He was an analyst. This was his job. He owed it to Ingenium. He owed it to them all. He slipped out of his apartment and back into the night. The air near Rehabilitation Center 07 tasted of rust and chemical smog. The facility was a monolithic block of black concrete that squatted in the middle of a desolate industrial park, sucking all the light out of the night. Searchlights swept across the perimeter, their beams cutting sharp, white paths through the gloom. A 10-meter-high fence topped with crackling coils of electricity surrounded the entire compound. Izuku lay flat on the roof of a derelict warehouse 200 meters away, peering through a pair of electronic binoculars. The QSB presence was even heavier than he'd anticipated. Guards on the walls, drones performing slow, overlapping patrol patterns. Every entry point was a death trap. He lowered the binoculars, his mind cataloging every detail. The guard shift change happened every 2 hours. The drone patrol routes had a 17-second blind spot near the southwest corner, by the waste heat vents. The main gate was a magnetic sealed blast door, but the pedestrian entrance used a biometric scanner that could potentially be spoofed if he could get close enough to a guard to lift a print. It was hopeless. A fortress. There was no way in. As he was about to retreat, to report back that the mission was a lost cause, a flicker of movement caught his eye. It was near the base of the wall, in the 17-second blind spot he had just identified. He raised his binoculars again, focusing on the spot. He saw nothing. Had he imagined it? Then he saw it again. A small pebble, lying near the base of the wall, lifted silently into the air, hovered for a second, and then dropped back to the ground. Izuku's heart leaped into his throat. A quirk. Someone else was here. He scanned the wall above the pebble. And then he saw her. A girl, pressed so flat against the dark concrete she was nearly invisible. She was wearing a dark jumpsuit, and her face was smudged with dirt. She had short brown hair and round, determined cheeks. He watched, mesmerized, as she placed her fingertips on the wall. The section of concrete beneath her hands seemed to glow with a faint pink energy, and then she began to climb, moving upward with an eerie, weightless grace. Zero gravity. She was neutralizing her own weight, and the weight of the handhold she touched, allowing her to scale the sheer surface like a spider. It was a brilliant, incredibly risky method of infiltration, but she was an amateur. She was making noise. Her feet scuffed against the concrete, sending tiny bits of debris raining down. And she was moving directly into the path of an oncoming patrol. Izuku's mind screamed. He had to warn her. But how? Shouting was a death sentence. He had no way to communicate. He looked around frantically. His eyes landed on a loose piece of conduit on the warehouse roof. An idea, insane and reckless, sparked in his mind. He couldn't use a powerful flick, not with his broken arm, but a tiny nudge. He crawled to the conduit, his left hand scrabbling for purchase. He aimed his left index finger at a small, rusted bolt on the wall below the climbing girl. He closed his eyes, picturing the flow of power, not a surge. A trickle. A whisper. 0.01%. Please, just 0.01%. He felt a faint tingle, a warmth that didn't escalate into pain. A tiny, invisible pulse of force shot from his fingertip. It was just enough. The rusted bolt, weakened by years of neglect, shuddered and fell, clattering onto the gravel path below. The girl froze. She heard it. She flattened herself against the wall just as two QSB guards rounded the corner. They swept their lights across the area, the beams passing inches below her feet. They paused, listening. One of them nudged the fallen bolt with his boot, shrugged, and they continued on their way. The girl let out a breath she must have been holding for a full minute. She looked down, trying to see what had made the noise, her eyes scanning the shadows. Her gaze passed over Izuku's position, but he was hidden in the deeper darkness of the rooftop. She was about to resume her climb when a voice, sharp and low, cut through the night from a different direction. Don't move! Izuku's head snapped towards the source of the voice. Another figure had emerged from the shadows at the base of the wall. This one was crouched low, almost blending in with a stack of discarded crates. The girl on the wall looked down, her eyes wide with alarm. Izuku felt a surge of panic. A confrontation here would bring the whole facility down on them. Suddenly, the world lit up. A patrol drone, deviating from its standard path, swept its powerful searchlight over their corner of the compound. There was nowhere to run. The girl was caught on the wall, the figure on the ground was exposed, and Izuku was silhouetted on the roof. In that split second of blinding light, Izuku's analytical mind processed everything. The girl, her face a mask of shock. The figure on the ground, wearing a cheap infiltration suit. And the drone, its red optic locking onto them, an alarm beginning to blare from its chassis. They were all caught. The figure on the ground moved with shocking speed, diving towards the only conceivable cover, a narrow, deep alcove behind a large transformer unit. At the same time, the girl on the wall did the only thing she could. She released her quirk, dropping the full 10 meters to the ground. She landed with a roll, the impact softened by her training, and scrambled for the same patch of darkness. Izuku, driven by pure instinct, slid off the far side of the warehouse roof, landing hard in a pile of refuse sacks that thankfully broke his fall. He ignored the jolt of pain in his arm and sprinted, keeping low, towards the only viable hiding spot. He dove into the alcove a half second after the girl, tumbling into the cramped, dark space. The three of them were crammed together in the pitch-black gap between the humming transformer and the cold concrete wall. The space was barely big enough for one person, let alone three. Izuku was pressed against the girl, her rapid, shallow breaths ghosting against his cheek. He could feel the tense, coiled muscles of the third person at his back. Outside, the drone's alarm shrieked, and he could hear the sound of running boots and shouted orders. The searchlight beams swept past the opening of their alcove, casting their cramped hiding spot into stark relief for a terrifying instant before plunging them back into darkness. They held their breath, a trio of strangers united by a common, immediate terror. They were trapped. And they were not alone. The world outside their cramped sanctuary was a symphony of institutional panic. The single, piercing shriek of the patrol drone was joined by the deeper, guttural blare of the compound's main alarm. Heavy boot falls pounded on the gravel perimeter path, a frantic, syncopated rhythm of impending doom. Beams from powerful flashlights sliced through the darkness, crisscrossing the air just beyond the mouth of their alcove. Inside, the silence was absolute, a shared vacuum of terror. 3 bodies were crammed into a space meant for electrical conduits and forgotten dust. Izuku was pressed face first against the cold, vibrating metal of the transformer unit. The smell of ozone and hot metal filled his nostrils. His right arm, splinted and throbbing, was wedged awkwardly between his chest and the wall, sending waves of muted pain through the fading anesthetic. The girl was crushed against his back, her body rigid. He could feel the frantic, rather fast beat of her heart against his shoulder blades. Behind her, the third person was a tense, solid presence, the source of the sharp whisper that had frozen them all just moments before. "Stay perfectly still," a voice hissed, so low it was more a vibration than a sound. It was the third person, the one who had been on the ground. The voice was male, clipped, and radiated an authority that grated on Izuku's frayed nerves. A searchlight beam swept directly across their hiding spot. For a terrifying half-second, the 3 of them were illuminated in stark white light. Izuku squeezed his eyes shut, his mind flashing with images of a null collar, of a sterile white cell. This was it. This was how it ended. In a forgotten corner of an industrial park, undone by sheer, idiotic bad luck. The beam moved on. The pounding footsteps drew closer, then paused right outside their alcove. Izuku held his breath, the air burning in his lungs. He could hear the crackle of a QSB radio. "Anything on the thermal?" one voice asked. "Negative, sir," a second voice replied. "Transformer unit is flooding the immediate area with heat. It's a total blind spot. Classic dead zone. Sweep it manually. Check every shadow." The drone registered 3 distinct biosignatures before it was disabled for recalibration. "They're here somewhere." A heavy boot scraped on the concrete, inches from Izuku's head. He could feel the vibrations through the ground. His entire body was a single, clenched muscle. The pilot light of One for All, the tiny, suppressed flame deep inside him, flickered erratically. He fought to keep it banked, terrified that even a spark of its energy would show up on whatever advanced scanners the QSB were using. "Clear here," a voice grunted. "Just dust and wiring. Damn it. Spread out. Expand the perimeter. They couldn't have gotten far. I want every crate, every drain pipe, every shadow checked twice. The Director General will have our badges if 3 anomalies slip through our fingers right on his doorstep." The footsteps moved away. The immediate threat receded, but the general alarm continued to blare, a constant, oppressive reminder of their predicament. They waited, frozen in their tableau of forced intimacy, for what felt like an eternity. 1 minute. 5. 10. The shouts grew more distant, the search patterns expanding away from their location. Finally, the girl pressed against Izuku's back let out a slow, shaky breath. I think they're gone." Her voice was a whisper, but it sounded like a shout in the confines of the alcove. "They are not gone," the male voice behind her corrected, his tone sharp and critical. "They have merely widened their search grid. We have, at most, a 10-minute window before they cycle back and perform a more thorough sweep of this sector. We need to move. Now." "Move where?" the girl shot back, a hint of defiance in her voice. "We're surrounded. In case you hadn't noticed, the place is on lockdown. Remaining here is a tactical dead end. It guarantees capture," the man stated, as if reading from a textbook. "The only logical course of action is to egress immediately." Izuku had heard enough. This bickering was going to get them all caught. He pushed himself away from the transformer, creating a precious few centimeters of space. He turned his head, his cheeks scraping against the rough concrete wall. "Both of you be quiet." His voice, though low, held a surprising firmness. It cut through their argument, and they both fell silent. In the dim, ambient light filtering into the alcove, he could just make out their faces. The girl had large, expressive brown eyes, wide with a mixture of fear and resolve. Her round cheeks were smudged with grease, and a determined set to her jaw suggested she wasn't easily intimidated. This was the zero-gravity user. The man was older, maybe early 20s. He had a severe, angular face, dark blue hair cut with military precision, and wore a pair of sharp, rectangular glasses. Even in the gloom, his posture was ramrod straight, his expression a mask of intense, frustrated concentration. He looked like a tactician who had just watched his perfectly planned operation spiral into chaos. "Who are you?" the man demanded, his eyes narrowing behind his glasses. "What is your objective here?" "Me?" Izuku countered, deflecting. "Who are you? You were both here long before I was. You're the ones who tripped the alarm." "I did not trip the alarm," the man snapped. "My approach was flawless. Her reckless ascent and your sudden appearance compromised the operational integrity." "My reckless ascent was getting me up that wall until you shouted at me," the girl retorted, jabbing a thumb back at the man. "And what about you?" "Just skulking in the shadows." "What was your plan?" "To politely ask them to open the gates." "My plan was to access the external security terminal linked to that transformer unit," the man said, pointing a rigid finger. "From there, I could have bypassed the perimeter fence's power grid and created a surgical point of entry. It was a plan that relied on subtlety, a concept you two seem unfamiliar with." Izuku's analytical mind whirred. An external terminal. Bypassing the power grid. This man wasn't just muscle. He had technical expertise. The girl had a powerful and versatile infiltration quirk. They were both here for the same reason he was: to get inside the facility. "We don't have time for this," Izuku said, asserting himself again. "He's right. Staying here is capture. Arguing is capture. We need to work together right now, or we're all going to end up in no collars." The girl looked at him, her initial defensiveness softening slightly. "Work together? We don't even know each other." "My name is Izuku Midoriya," he offered, deciding that code names were a luxury they couldn't afford. "I'm here because I received a distress call. Ingenium has been captured." The name hung in the air, a catalyst. The girl's eyes widened in recognition. "Ingenium. I've heard of him. The courier. He's the one who gets supplies to the outer sector shelters." The man in the glasses, however, stiffened as if struck. His entire demeanor changed. The cold, tactical mask cracked, revealing a raw, personal anguish beneath. You know about my brother?" Izuku stared at him. "Brother? Tensei Ida is your brother?" The man pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose, a gesture that failed to conceal the tremor in his hand. "My name is Tenya Ida. And yes, Tensei is my older brother. The current head of our family, the hero I have always looked up to. I am here to get him out." The pieces clicked into place. This wasn't just a mission for him, it was a crusade. His rigid, by-the-book demeanor, his frustration at their chaotic methods, it all stemmed from a desperate, personal need to succeed. The girl's expression softened completely, her anger replaced by a wave of empathy. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't know." She extended a hand towards him. "I'm Ochako Uraraka." Ida looked at her outstretched hand for a moment before giving it a short, stiff shake. "A pleasure, under more favorable circumstances. My parents," Uraraka began, her voice quiet but firm, as if she felt the need to justify her own presence. "They ran a small construction company. They both have minor quirks, useful for lifting and moving materials. When the Suppression Act was fully enforced, their business was declared an anomaly hazard. They lost everything. The QSB bankrupted them, seized their assets. They're good people who were punished just for being born. I fight for them. For everyone the system has crushed." Izuku listened, a sense of profound connection settling over him. He was no longer just a solitary ghost helping other faceless ghosts. He was here, in the dark, with two people who had names, faces, and reasons. Tensei Ida, the brother fighting for his family. Ochako Uraraka, the daughter fighting for justice. And he, Izuku Midoriya, the inheritor fighting for, what? For a future where a little girl isn't collared for making apples float. "So we all have the same goal," Izuku said, his voice gaining confidence. He was no longer just a participant. He was starting to see the whole board. "We all need to get inside. Ida-san, you have the technical knowledge. Uraraka-san, you have the infiltration skills. And I." He paused. What did he have? A broken arm and a secret too dangerous to reveal. I'm a good analyst. Ida looked at him skeptically. An analyst? What good is that right now? The QSB patrol that just passed, Izuku said, his words coming faster as his mind raced. Their patrol route is a standard 2-hour loop, but after an alarm, they switch to a compressed 20-minute sweep pattern. Their primary focus is on a radial search expanding outward from the point of alert. That means this area, the origin point, will be relatively clear for the next. He glanced at his chrono. 12 minutes. Ida and Uraraka stared at him. How do you know that? Uraraka asked, her eyes wide. I study their protocols, Izuku said simply. I know their patterns. I know their blind spots. And I know that our only chance isn't to run away from the facility, but to go into it. It's the last place they'll expect us to go now. The audacity of the idea was staggering. To run deeper into the lion's den while the lions were busy searching the fields outside. It was counterintuitive, reckless, and utterly insane. It was also perfect. Ida adjusted his glasses again, but this time it was a thoughtful gesture. He was looking at Izuku with a new, appraising expression. The initial dismissal was gone, replaced by a grudging respect. The tactical theory is sound. The enemy's focus is directed outward. A rapid, targeted infiltration now would exploit their procedural weakness. But how do we get in? Uraraka asked, glancing at the electrified fence. Your plan to disable the fence is out, Ida-san. The terminal is in the open. The walls, then, Ida said, looking at Uraraka. Your quirk. It's our best option for a silent entry. I can get myself up, but I can't carry both of you, Uraraka said, shaking her head. My quirk has a weight limit. I've never tried to lift 2 other people, especially not while climbing. You don't have to carry us, Izuku said, the plan forming in his mind, a complex schematic of interlocking parts. He was no longer just an analyst, he was a conductor, seeing where each instrument needed to play. You just have to get something for us. He pointed up, towards the top of the wall. The searchlights. They're mounted on swiveling turrets. Each turret has a service cable that runs down the side of the wall to a junction box. Uraraka-san, you can climb the wall. Can you get to one of those cables? Uraraka followed his gaze, her eyes tracing the thick, black cable. Yes. I can get there. Okay. Izuku continued, his voice low and urgent. You're going to climb to that cable. Don't cut it. Just attach this to it. He reached into his satchel with his good hand and pulled out a small, metallic clamp attached to a spool of high-tensile wire. It was thin, strong, and non-conductive. Attach the clamp, then drop the spool down to us. He then turned to Ida. Ida-san, that transformer unit. What's its power output? Ida blinked, surprised by the question, but his technical mind took over instantly. Judging by its size and the gauge of the primary conduits, it's a standard municipal step-down transformer. It likely converts a 10,000-volt line to a more stable 240-volt output for the facility's non-critical systems, like perimeter lighting and, comprehension dawned on his face. The fence. Exactly. Izuku confirmed. The main power is internal, but the perimeter fence probably runs off a secondary system powered by this unit. The QSB wouldn't want a facility-wide power failure to also disable their primary security measure. It's a redundancy, a flawed redundancy. Ida breathed, a spark of excitement in his eyes. If we could create a power surge, a massive overload, we could trip the breakers for the entire perimeter grid. It would knock out the fence and the searchlights for at least a few minutes before the backup generators kick in. And how do we create a surge like that? Uraraka asked. Izuku looked at the spool of wire in his hand, then at the massive, high-voltage lines feeding into the top of the transformer. We give it more power than it can handle. We're going to bypass the step-down converter entirely. The plan was laid bare. Uraraka would climb the wall and secure one end of the wire to the searchlight's power cable. Then, she would drop the other end to them. They would attach it directly to the main 10,000-volt input line on the transformer. The massive surge of raw power would flow up the wire, into the perimeter lighting system, and overload the entire grid. It would create a short, chaotic window of darkness and safety. It was a brilliant, dangerous, and incredibly complex plan to have been conceived in under a minute in a dark, cramped alcove. For the first time since they'd met, Ida looked at Izuku without a trace of skepticism. He saw not a bumbling amateur, but a strategist, a mind capable of seeing connections and opportunities that he himself had missed. Uraraka, too, was looking at him with a new sense of awe and trust. She had come here with a desperate, half-formed plan to scale a wall. Izuku had just given them a key. The risk of electrocution is astronomical, Ida stated, but his tone wasn't dismissive. It was analytical. We will need to be precise. I can do it, Uraraka said, her voice firm with newfound resolve. I can get the wire up there. Good, Izuku said, a surge of adrenaline momentarily washing away the pain in his arm. He looked between the two of them. A girl with the power to defy gravity. A man with the mind of an engineer. A ragtag, desperate trio. They were the only hope Tensei Ida had. Let's go over the timing, Izuku said, his voice dropping back to a whisper as he began to lay out the final, crucial details. The patrol will be back in 9 minutes. We have to move now. For the first time since he had inherited the awesome, terrible power of One for All, Izuku Midoriya wasn't just a survivor. He wasn't just a cog in the machine. In the oppressive shadow of the QSB's fortress, surrounded by enemies, he was giving orders. He was a leader. And as Uraraka and Ida nodded in grim agreement, ready to follow his insane plan, he realized that a secret fire was useless if it wasn't used to light the way for others. He was finally stepping out of the shadows. The 12-minute window Izuku had predicted felt like 12 seconds. Every moment was stretched thin by a high-tension wire of adrenaline and fear. The blaring alarm had ceased, replaced by an even more unnerving, organized silence. The QSB were no longer reacting, they were hunting. Ready? Izuku whispered, his voice barely a breath in the oppressive quiet of the industrial park. Uraraka gave a sharp, determined nod, her round face set in a mask of concentration. In her hands she clutched a metallic clamp and the spool of non-conductive wire. Ida stood beside her, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning the perimeter with a frantic intensity, watching for the return of the patrols. The drone patrol route has a 17-second gap in the southwest quadrant, Izuku recited, his analytical mind a calming mantra against the chaos in his chest. That's our window. You have to be on the wall and climbing before the next drone rounds the corner. Go on my mark. He watched the slow, inexorable drift of the nearest hover drone. It was a black disk against the slightly less black sky, its single red optic a baleful, searching eye. It reached the apex of its designated patrol path and began a slow turn. No! Izuku hissed. Uraraka moved like a shot. She darted from the relative safety of their alcove, her movements fluid and silent. She reached the base of the 10-meter wall and pressed her fingertips against the rough concrete. A faint pink aura, visible only to those looking for it, pulsed from her hands. She took a deep, steadying breath, and then she began to climb. Her ascent was an act of breathtaking defiance against the laws of physics. She moved with an eerie, weightless grace, her feet finding purchase on minuscule imperfections in the wall, her body seemingly immune to the pull of gravity. She was a spider, a ghost, an impossibility scaling the face of the fortress. Izuku and Ida watched from the shadows, their hearts in their throats. Every small scrape of her shoe on the concrete sounded like a gunshot. The drone was completing its turn. They had seconds. She reached the thick, armored power cable for the searchlight, a black serpent running down the wall. With practiced speed she clipped the clamp onto it, ensuring a solid connection. She gave it a firm tug, then unspooled the wire, letting it drop. It fell in a silent, perfect line, landing in a soft coil on the gravel below. She did it! Ida breathed, a note of pure awe in his voice. Just as Uraraka flattened herself against the wall, making herself as small as possible, the drone's red eye swept over her position. It paused for a fraction of a second. Izuku's blood ran cold. Had it seen her? The drone hovered, its internal sensors likely debating the anomaly, before it apparently dismissed it as a shadow or a trick of the light, and continued on its patrol route. Uraraka remained frozen, a statue of pure nerve. Our turn! Izuku grunted, grabbing the end of the wire. He and Ida sprinted from their hiding spot to the base of the massive transformer unit. The thing hummed with contained power, a sleeping giant that they were about to violently awaken. The primary input lines are there, Ida said, pointing to the top of the unit where 3 thick, heavily insulated cables connected to ceramic insulators. The voltage is lethal. A single touch, even through standard gear, will stop your heart. The non-conductive wire is our only protection. We only need to connect it for a second, Izuku said, his mind racing. Long enough to create the surge. Ida-san, you watch for patrols. I'll make the connection. Your arm, Ida protested, gesturing to Izuku's splinted limb. You can't possibly. I have one good hand. Izuku cut him off, his tone leaving no room for argument. That's all I need. Just watch my back. Ida hesitated for a second, his logical mind warring with the sheer insanity of the situation. He looked at Izuku's determined face, the face of the boy who had concocted this plan, and nodded stiffly. Be careful, Midoriya-kun. He took up a watch position, his body tense. Izuku took a deep breath, the smell of ozone and rain-dampened dust filling his lungs. He held the end of the thin, dark wire in his left hand. This was the point of no return. He had to loop the wire around one of the high-voltage input lines. It was a simple action, but the consequences of failure were absolute. He reached up, his fingers trembling slightly. He could feel the immense, raw power radiating from the main lines, a static charge that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. He focused, channeling all his concentration into this one, single task. He looped the wire over the thickest of the 3 cables. The moment the wire made contact, the universe seemed to hold its breath. For a split second, nothing happened. Then, a brilliant blue-white arc of pure electricity, thick as his wrist, erupted from the connection point. It leaped from the main line to the thin wire with a deafening crack that echoed through the industrial park. The wire glowed incandescent white for a microsecond, a filament of pure energy. The power surge shot up the wire towards the wall. The searchlight it was connected to exploded in a shower of sparks and shattered glass. The entire perimeter fence let out a percussive, zapping sound as every one of its electrical coils overloaded simultaneously, glowing cherry red before going dark. The hum of the facility's external grid died with a final, pathetic groan. They were plunged into absolute, disorienting darkness. It worked! Izuku yelled over the ringing in his ears, scrambling back from the transformer. Uraraka-san, get down! On the wall, Uraraka released her quirk and dropped, using the last of her energy to lighten her own body just enough to survive the fall. She landed in a crouch beside them. The facility was in chaos. Shouted, confused orders echoed from the walls. Backup generators were kicking in, but they powered the internal lights first. The perimeter was still dark and, most importantly, the fence was dead. The main gate! Ida shouted, pointing. The magnetic lock will be disabled. It will be on manual override, but it's our only way in. He was right. It was their only chance. The trio broke into a desperate sprint, their feet crunching on the gravel as they raced towards the main vehicle entrance 50 meters away. They were running on pure adrenaline, a tiny, defiant force against the fortress. They were halfway there when the night erupted. It didn't start with a sound. It started with a flash of brilliant, orange light from the other side of the city, a silent pulse that painted the undersides of the clouds. A second later, a deep, resonant boom rolled over them, a physical pressure wave that rattled the corrugated metal walls of the surrounding warehouses. Izuku, Ida, and Uraraka stumbled to a halt, staring in stunned disbelief at the blossoming pillar of fire and smoke rising into the night sky. What in the world was that? Uraraka gasped. Another explosion, this one closer, ripped through a QSB precinct building on the edge of the industrial district. The sound was sharp and violent, a percussive blast that shattered windows for blocks around. Secondary explosions followed, a string of percussive pops as vehicles in the precinct's motor pool caught fire. It's him! Izuku breathed, a strange mix of dread and awe filling him. He knew that specific brand of chaotic, overwhelming destruction. There was only one person in the city who fought like that. Who? Ida demanded, his head swiveling between the new threat and their objective. A vigilante, Izuku said, his voice grim. They call him Dynamite. As if summoned by his name, a third, massive explosion tore the roof off a QSB watchtower less than a kilometer away. This time they saw the source, a tiny figure, propelled through the air by controlled bursts of flame from his palms, arcing like a human meteor against the backdrop of the fires he had created. The QSB radio frequencies, which Ida was monitoring on a small handheld scanner, exploded into a cacophony of panic. All units! All units! Code Crimson Alert! Dynamite is attacking Sector Gamma! Repeat, Dynamite is leveling the Gamma Precinct! All available forces converge! The hunt for 3 minor infiltrators was instantly forgotten. The full, terrifying weight of the QSB's military might was being redirected. Maglev's sirens began to wail across the city as armored transports were rerouted. The threat of 3 mice in a barn was nothing compared to a rabid wolf tearing the barn down. This is an opportunity, Ida said, his tactical mind overriding his shock. Their forces are divided. Their command structure is in chaos. We must press our advantage. He was right. This unplanned, violent intervention had created the perfect diversion. They sprinted the remaining distance to the main gate. As Ida had predicted, the massive blast door was inert, its magnetic locks dead. It was sealed by a heavy, manual locking mechanism, but there was a man-sized maintenance hatch set into the door, bolted from the outside. My quirk, Uraraka said, stepping forward. She placed her hands on the heavy hatch. It glowed pink, and with a grunt of effort, she lifted the half-ton slab of reinforced steel as if it were made of cardboard, moving it aside to reveal a dark opening into the facility. They scrambled through, one after another, into the belly of the beast. They found themselves in a sterile, white loading bay. The internal lights were on, powered by the backup generators, casting everything in a harsh, clinical glare. The air was cold and smelled of disinfectant. We need to find the detention block, Ida said, his voice low and urgent. The schematics I saw showed it in sub-level 3. We need to find a stairwell, avoid the main elevators. They moved deeper into the facility, a maze of identical white corridors. The place was eerily quiet. The diversion had worked almost too well. The bulk of the internal guards had clearly been dispatched to deal with the external chaos. They were ghosts in a suddenly empty machine. They found a stairwell and began their descent, their footsteps echoing in the enclosed space. As they reached the landing for sub-level 2, the door burst open. 2 QSB guards, caught by surprise, stood there, their sonic rifles half raised. There was no time to think. Uraraka reacted instantly. She slapped her hand on the floor, making a 2-meter section of it weightless. The 2 guards, suddenly standing on a surface with no gravity, flailed wildly as they began to float upwards. Ida, moving with a surprising burst of speed, shot forward and disarmed them while they were disoriented, their rifles clattering to the ground. Izuku, his broken arm useless, used his one good hand to help Ida restrain the guards, using their own zip cuffs. They bundled the 2 unconscious men into a small maintenance closet. Well done, Ida said, giving Uraraka a nod of genuine respect. Your reaction time is exemplary. Uraraka flushed, but her eyes were bright with confidence. We make a good team. They continued down to sub-level 3. This level was different. The walls were reinforced, the lighting dimmer. The air was colder, filled with a palpable sense of misery. This was the detention block. A long corridor stretched before them, lined with heavy steel doors, each with a small, barred window. Tensei! Ida called out, his voice a desperate whisper. He ran down the corridor, peering into each window. Izuku and Uraraka followed, their eyes scanning the cells. They saw faces, haggard, broken people, some with the vacant, listless stare of those who had given up hope, others with eyes that burned with a defiant hatred. They were the cured, the rehabilitated. Here! Ida cried out from the end of the corridor. He's here! They ran to his side. Inside the last cell, a man was lying on a narrow cot. He had the same sharp, angular features as Tenya, but his face was bruised and swollen. His arm was in a crude sling, and a red diagnostic collar, less severe than a null collar, but still a mark of imprisonment, was clasped around his neck. It was Tensei Ida. Ingenium. The lock is electronic, Ida said, his hands flying over the keypad on the door. Standard QSB encryption. I can bypass it, but I need a minute. As he worked, His fingers a blur on the keypad, Tensei's eyes fluttered open. He saw his brother and a weak, relieved smile touched his lips. Tenya, you fool! You shouldn't have come. I will not abandon my family. Tenya replied, not looking up from his work. The lock clicked open. The door hissed aside. They rushed in, and Izuku and Uraraka helped the injured Tensei to his feet. He was weak, leaning heavily on them. We have to go, Izuku urged. Their response time will be. He was cut off by the sound of heavy, running footsteps from the stairwell. A squad of 4 elite QSB guards, clad in heavier armor, had arrived. They had been left behind as a skeleton crew, and they had finally located the intruders. Anomaly scum! Their leader yelled, raising his pulse rifle. Surrender now! They were trapped. The corridor was a kill box. There was nowhere to run, and then, the ceiling exploded. Concrete and wiring rained down as a massive hole was blown in the roof of the corridor from the level above. A figure dropped through the opening, landing in a perfect 3-point crouch between the resistance members and the QSB squad. He rose to his full height, a wild silhouette against the dust and debris. He wore a dark, militaristic costume with grenade-like gauntlets on his forearms. A jagged black mask covered his eyes, but it couldn't hide the feral, triumphant grin on his face. His spiky, ash-blonde hair seemed to crackle with latent energy. It was dynamite. It was Katsuki Bakugo. Well, Bakugo sneered, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. Look at the little mice, scurrying around in the dark. Thought you could have all the fun without me? The QSB squad leader stared at him, his professional composure cracking. Dynamite! You're under arrest! Open fire! The squad opened fire, unleashing a volley of sonic pulses. Bakugo just laughed. He raised his palms, and with a series of deafening explosions, he propelled himself sideways, dodging the blasts with acrobatic precision. The sonic pulses slammed into the wall behind him, cracking the concrete. My turn! Bakugo growled. He landed, braced himself, and thrust his right palm forward. AP shot! A concentrated, armor-piercing blast of explosive energy shot from his hand. It wasn't a wide, chaotic explosion. It was a focused, piercing beam of force. It struck the lead guard square in the chest, sending him flying down the corridor to smash into the far wall with a sickening crunch. The remaining 3 guards faltered, their faces pale with terror. Who is this guy? Uraraka whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of horror and awe. Izuku couldn't answer. He was staring at the ghost from his past. This was Kaken. But he was twisted, honed into something terrifying and powerful. The angry, arrogant boy he knew had become a one-man army. You want to hide in the shadows? Skulking around, freeing one person at a time? Bakugo said, not looking at them but directing his words straight at Izuku. It was as if he had known Izuku was there all along. That's not how you win a war. You don't win by hiding. You win by burning the shadows down. He launched himself at the remaining guards, a whirlwind of explosions and violence. It wasn't a fight, it was a demolition. Within seconds the 3 guards were unconscious, their armor dented and smoking. Bakugo stood over them, his gauntlets steaming. He turned slowly, his crimson eyes locking onto Izuku's. The grin was gone, replaced by a familiar, intense scowl. Deku! He spat the name, the old, cruel nickname from their childhood. Still a useless, pathetic weakling, playing hero in a place you don't belong. Kaken! Izuku said, his voice barely audible. Don't call me that. Bakugo snapped. He took a step closer, his gaze sweeping over the others. So this is your little club of bleeding hearts? A girl who floats, and a couple of stick-in-the-mud brothers? Pathetic. We are a resistance, Ida said, stepping forward protectively, positioning himself in front of his injured brother. And we are grateful for the diversion, but your methods are reckless and endanger civilians. Bakugo let out a harsh laugh. Reckless? Look around you, 4 eyes. My reckless methods got your sorry asses out of a jam. My methods are the only thing these QSB bastards understand. Overwhelming. Power, that's not the only way, Izuku said, finding his voice. You can't just burn everything down, Kaken. You have to build something, too. You have to protect people, not just punish your enemies. It was the argument they'd been having since they were children, now played out on a bigger, more dangerous stage. The idealist versus the pragmatist. The shield versus the sword. Protect people? Bakugo sneered. You protect people by eliminating the threat. Permanently. Anything else is just waiting for them to come back stronger. Their ideological clash was cut short by the sound of approaching sirens, this time from within the facility. A much larger, much more heavily armed QSB response team was on its way. TCH, fun's over, Bakugo grumbled. He glanced at the ceiling. Time to go. He looked back at Izuku, his expression unreadable. Don't think this makes us friends, Deku. You stay out of my way. Wait, Izuku said, a sudden, desperate idea forming. He saw the battlefield with his analyst's eyes. He saw Bakugo's raw power and Ida's tactical mind. He saw Uraraka's versatility and his own strategic oversight. They were disparate, conflicting parts, but together. The west wall of this corridor, Izuku said quickly, pointing. It's a load-bearing wall, but the schematics show a structural weakness right there, behind that support pillar. It's the thinnest point on this entire sublevel. It backs onto an old sewer maintenance tunnel. Bakugo paused, his head tilting slightly. He looked at the wall, then back at Izuku, a flicker of something, begrudging interest, in his crimson eyes. He could see the logic. A straight fight out of the facility was now impossible. But a quick, unconventional exit. You want me to blow a hole for you? He asked, a slow, dangerous grin spreading across his face. You want me to be your key? It's the only way out for all of us, Izuku said, meeting his gaze. Unless you want to try and fight a whole platoon by yourself, Bakugo scoffed, but there was no real heat in it. He knew Izuku was right. He hated it, but he knew it. He walked over to the spot Izuku had indicated, placing his palm against the concrete. Fine, he grunted. But you owe me one, Deku. He took a deep breath. Stand back, extras! He unleashed a powerful, sustained blast. It wasn't the piercing AP shot, but a wider, concussive explosion. The wall groaned, cracked, and then imploded, revealing a dark, foul-smelling tunnel behind it. Go! Bakugo yelled. Ida and Uraraka helped Tensei through the opening. Izuku hesitated, looking back at Bakugo. For a single, fleeting moment their eyes met. There was no friendship there, no warmth. But there was a flicker of something else. A grudging respect. Bakugo had seen the value in Izuku's mind, the tactical advantage of his analysis. And Izuku had seen the undeniable, awe-inspiring effectiveness of Bakugo's power. They were opposites, oil and water, but for a single, desperate moment, they had been on the same side. Get out of here, Deku! Bakugo growled, turning to face the sound of the approaching QSB squad, a wolf ready to greet the hounds. This is my party now. Izuku scrambled through the hole into the darkness of the sewer tunnel just as Bakugo unleashed another series of deafening explosions, collapsing the tunnel entrance behind them and plunging them into complete, echoing darkness. They were safe. They were free. But they had left a ghost behind them, a whirlwind of fire and fury who was fighting a war all his own. The darkness of the sewer tunnel was a stark contrast to the explosive chaos they had left behind. It was a thick, cloying blackness, heavy with the smell of damp earth, stagnant water, and decay. The only sounds were their own ragged breaths, the drip-drip-drip of water from the curved ceiling, and the distant, thunderous rumble of Bakugo's ongoing battle. A fading echo that was both their salvation and a terrifying reminder of the forces at play. Is everyone all right? Izuku asked, his voice sounding small and tight in the enclosed space. His good hand fumbled in his satchel, retrieving a small, palm-sized chemical light stick. He snapped it, and a cool green glow bloomed, pushing back the oppressive dark. The light revealed their small, battered party. Uraraka was leaning against the rough-hewn rock wall, her face pale and smudged with soot, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Ida was kneeling, meticulously checking the bindings on his brother's makeshift sling. Tensei Ida, the rescued ingenium, was slumped against the wall, conscious but clearly exhausted, his face a mask of pain and relief. We are functional, Ida reported, his voice a low, formal rumble that did little to hide his own frayed nerves. He looked up at Izuku, his expression a complex mixture of gratitude and bewilderment. Your plan, Midoriya-kun, it was unorthodox, chaotic, and relied far too heavily on unplanned variables. He paused, pushing his glasses up his nose. But it was successful. I am in your debt. We were all in it together. Izuku deflected, uncomfortable with the praise. He looked at the collapsed tunnel entrance, now a solid wall of rubble. Bakugo had bought them their escape, sealing himself in with the QSB. A part of Izuku's heart ached with a familiar, childhood worry for his former friend, but his analytical mind knew Bakugo was a force of nature, a creature in his element amidst violence and chaos. He would likely escape. The real question was the cost. Where do we go from here? Uraraka asked, her voice regaining some of its strength. We can't go back to our old hiding spots. After this, the QSB will be tearing the city apart looking for us. My apartment will be the first place they check. Mine as well, Ida added grimly. They will have connected me to Tensei's disappearance by now. We are officially fugitives. We have no resources, no shelter. He was right. They were adrift. They had won the battle but now faced the daunting strategic reality of the war. They had poked the hornet's nest, and the full swarm would be coming for them. There is a place, Izuku said quietly, the words feeling heavy with responsibility. He had hoped he would never have to use it, never have to expose it. It was his deepest secret, a place even Tashinori only knew about in theory. It was his bolt hole, his workshop, his sanctuary. It's not much. But it's safe, and it's hidden in a way the QSB would never think to look. He looked at the small group. Uraraka's trusting eyes. Ida's newfound cautious respect. Tensei's weary gratitude. They were his responsibility now. Their lives were tied to his. The thought was terrifying. Follow me, he said, turning and leading them deeper into the Stygian labyrinth of the city's forgotten underbelly. And stay quiet. Some of these tunnels are still on the old municipal acoustic sensors. Their journey was a descent into the past. The sewer tunnel, clearly ancient, eventually opened into a much larger network, the abandoned veins of Musudafu's original subway system. The Great Purge and the subsequent societal restructuring had led to the construction of the silent, efficient maglev network high above. These old tunnels, a relic of a noisier, more chaotic time, had been sealed and forgotten, erased from modern municipal maps, but not from the old paper archives Izuku had spent months studying in the digital library. He led them through vast, cathedral-like caverns where multiple tracks once converged, their footsteps echoing in the immense silence. Ghost stations flickered in the green glow of his light stick, their tiled walls covered in grime and faded advertisements for products and concepts that no longer existed. It was a tomb for a bygone era. After nearly an hour of walking, Tensei leaning heavily on his brother, Izuku stopped before a section of wall that looked no different from any other. It was a grimy, concrete expanse between two support pillars. A dead end? Uraraka asked, her breath misting in the cold air. Izuku didn't answer. He ran his hand over the wall, his fingers searching for something only he could see. He found it, a series of almost invisible cracks in the concrete, forming a rectangle. He pressed a specific spot on the lower right corner. There was a low groan of protesting, rusted metal, and the section of wall swung inward, revealing a dark opening. It wasn't a door. It was a counterweighted section of wall, a secret entrance he had spent weeks engineering. Welcome, he said softly. To the shelter, he led them through. The space beyond was not what they expected. It was a large, vaulted section of the old subway, a maintenance and switching hub that had been cleared and repurposed. The air was still cold, but it was dry and clean, circulated by a silent, jury-rigged ventilation system that Izuku had built, complete with charcoal filters to scrub the air of any trackable particulates. The space was lit by a string of low-wattage LED lights, powered by a bank of rechargeable batteries connected to a single, discreetly placed solar panel on a distant, derelict rooftop, miles away. The main area was spartan but organized. There were several cots lined up against one wall, each with a neat pile of blankets. A makeshift kitchenette in one corner held a small water purifier, a hot plate, and shelves stocked with ration bars and canned goods. But the heart of the space was the workshop. A long workbench was covered in a controlled chaos of electronics, wiring, and specialized tools. Data slates were disassembled, their parts laid out like dissected insects. A half-finished device, bristling with antennas and wires, sat in a vise. And pinned to a massive corkboard that covered an entire wall was a sight that made Ida and Uraraka stop in their tracks. It was Izuku's true work. A vast, terrifyingly detailed map of Muzurifu, but it was overlaid with patrol routes, QSB station locations, and surveillance drone dead zones, all marked with color-coded pins and connected by a web of colored string. There were profiles on key QSB commanders, schematics of their equipment, and handwritten notes on their tactics and psychological patterns. It was the nervous system of their enemy, dissected and laid bare. "Midoriya-kun," Ida whispered, stepping closer to the board, his eyes wide behind his glasses. This is the most comprehensive intelligence I have ever seen. The official resistance network doesn't have anything close to this level of detail. I'm a good analyst," Izuku repeated, the words feeling thin and inadequate now. "You're not an analyst," Tensei said, his voice raspy but firm. He had been helped to a cot, and was looking at Izuku with a profound sense of understanding. "You're a strategist. A spy master." Before Izuku could respond, two figures emerged from a side tunnel, their movements cautious until they recognized him. One was a girl with long, dark green hair and a wide, frog-like face. Her large, dark eyes blinked slowly, taking in the newcomers. She wore a waterproof jumpsuit and moved with a quiet, amphibious grace. The other was a young man with bright red hair, styled into defiant spikes. His smile was a flash of sharp, almost shark-like teeth, but it was warm and genuine. His arms were bare, revealing a powerful, muscular build. He had a bandage wrapped around his head, but his eyes were bright and full of energy. "Deku! You're back!" the red-haired boy exclaimed, his voice a cheerful boom that seemed out of place in the subterranean quiet. "We heard the booms. We were worried." "I'm fine, Kirishima-kun," Izuku said, a small, genuine smile touching his lips. "Everything is under control." "You've brought guests, Karo," the frog-like girl observed, her gaze calm and assessing as it moved from Uraraka to the Ida brothers. Izuku made the introductions. "This is Ochako Uraraka, Tenya Ida, and his brother, Tensei. They'll be staying with us. Everyone, this is Tsuyu Ajiri and Ijiro Kirishima." Uraraka and Ida looked at the newcomers, realizing that Izuku's secret shelter was not so solitary after all. This was more than a hideout. It was a home. "It's an honor to meet you," Kirishima said, giving a short, respectful bow. His eyes lit up as he looked at Tensei. "You're Ingenium, right? Wow. It's so manly, the way you get supplies to everyone." Tensei managed a weak smile. "Just doing my part." Ajiri, or Tsu as she insisted on being called, was more reserved. She looked at their battered appearances, her gaze lingering on Tensei's injuries and Izuku's splintered arm. "You ran into trouble," she stated simply. "You could say that," Izuku said wryly. He turned to the group. "Kirishima-kun and Tsu-chan are key members of our operation here," he went on to explain. Kirishima's quirk was hardening. He could make his entire body as hard as rock, turning him into a living shield. He was the group's protector, the one who would stand in the line of fire, who could block a doorway or absorb a sonic blast that would incapacitate anyone else. He was the unbreachable wall. Ajiri's quirk was frog. She could do everything a frog could do, stick to walls, extend a long and powerful tongue, and breathe underwater. She was their scout for the city's canal systems and flooded underground tunnels, the silent infiltrator for locations inaccessible by any other means. She was their eyes in the unseen parts of the city. Uraraka and Ida listened, their understanding of Izuku's world expanding with every word. He wasn't just a lone analyst feeding information into the ether. He had built a team, a small, specialized cell operating completely off the grid of the main resistance. He had found people with unique, non-combat-oriented quirks and had given them a purpose, a way to fight back that played to their strengths. We are the shepherds," Kirishima explained, his cheerful demeanor turning serious for a moment. "That's what Deku calls us. Our job isn't to fight big battles like that dynamite guy. Our job is to protect the flock. To rescue people who get caught, to guide them to safety, to get them the supplies they need to survive. A noble philosophy, Tensei murmured from his cot, his eyes fixed on Izuku. Izuku felt a flush of heat on his cheeks. He walked over to his workbench, busying himself with tidying up some loose wires to avoid their gazes. He hadn't intended to become a leader. It had happened by accident. He had found Kirishima trying to defend a group of kids from a QSB shakedown, using his hardening quirk to shield them and getting brutally beaten for his trouble. Izuku had created a diversion and helped him escape, recognizing the boy's purely protective instincts. He had found Ajri living in the flooded lower levels, surviving on her own, and had offered her a safe, dry place to stay in exchange for her help navigating the waterways. He had given them shelter, and in return, they had given him their loyalty. They didn't see him as a fighter. They saw him as the brain, the one who saw the whole board and told them where to move to keep everyone safe. He was their Deku. He had taken the name that Bakugo had used to mean useless and, in this small, hidden corner of the world, it had come to mean the one who can. Over the next few hours, the shelter buzzed with a quiet, focused energy. Tsu, with a surprising knowledge of field medicine, helped Ida properly clean and dress Tensei's wounds, removing the QSB diagnostic collar with a set of specialized clippers from Izuku's workbench. Kirishima stood guard at the entrance, his senses on high alert. Uraraka, after a moment of hesitation, began helping Izuku organize the surprisingly large stockpile of medical supplies and rations he had accumulated over the months. "How did you get all this?" she asked, her voice soft with wonder as she stacked packets of nutrient paste. "A little bit at a time," Izuku explained, not looking up from the data slate he was repairing. "Skimming inventories, intercepting misdirected shipments, exploiting glitches in the QSB supply chain. They have so much, they don't notice the little bits that go missing. Especially when a glitch erases the record of it ever being there." Uraraka watched him, his one good hand moving with incredible precision, soldering a tiny connection on a circuit board. She saw the intense focus in his eyes, the way his mind seemed to be working on multiple levels at once. She remembered the boy in the alcove, the one who had taken charge, who had seen a path to survival when all she had seen was a dead end. He wasn't a fighter in the traditional sense. He didn't have a flashy, powerful quirk for combat. His power was his mind, his compassion, and the secret, terrifying strength he kept hidden. He was the foundation of this place, the quiet center around which they all revolved. As the makeshift team settled, a new dynamic began to form. Ida, with his rigid, logical mind, found himself drawn to Izuku's intelligence board. He began pointing out potential inconsistencies in patrol schedules, suggesting more efficient routes for supply drops, his own strategic mind clicking into sync with Izuku's. He saw the shepherd philosophy not as passive, but as a highly efficient form of asymmetrical warfare focused on asset protection and resource denial. "Your focus on non-combatants is strategically sound," Ida commented, pushing his glasses up. "The QSB's greatest weapon is fear. By providing sanctuary and proving that capture is not the end, you directly counter their primary psychological tool." "It is brilliant." Izuku mumbled a thank you, his face beet red. Praise, especially from someone as formal and intelligent as Ida, still made him intensely flustered. Later, as Tensei rested more comfortably, Tenya Ida found himself in a quiet corner, observing the group. He saw Kirishima showing Uraraka how to reinforce a section of the tunnel wall to prevent collapses, his boisterous enthusiasm infectious. He saw Tsu silently mending a tear in Izuku's satchel, her long tongue deftly manipulating a needle and thread. He watched Izuku, who was now quietly talking to Tensei, getting a full report of how he was captured, the interrogation methods the QSB used, any information he might have gleaned about their internal procedures. Even in a moment of rest, Izuku's mind was working, gathering data, updating his mental map of the enemy. Ida felt a profound sense of dislocation. His entire life had been defined by rules, by order, by the proper way of doing things. The official resistance, from what little he knew through his brother, tried to emulate a formal, military structure. But it was slow, cumbersome, and riddled with paranoia. This was different. It wasn't a military unit. It was a family. A strange, mismatched family of misfits, united by a quiet, freckled boy who had somehow built a fortress of hope in the city's forgotten bowels. He approached Izuku, who was now alone, staring at his wall of string and pins. "Midoriya-kun," Ida began formally. "I must confess I initially misjudged you. Your methods are unconventional. But your leadership, your dedication to protecting others, it is the very definition of heroic." Izuku flinched at the word. "I'm not a hero, Ida-san. I'm just trying to keep people safe." "Is that not the same thing?" Ida countered. He looked at the board. "But this approach, the shepherd philosophy, it is noble, but it is reactive. We rescue those who have already fallen into the wolf's grasp. We do not stop the wolf from hunting." Izuku turned to him, his green eyes dark and serious. The flustered boy was gone, replaced by the strategist. "I know. We're a field hospital, not an army. We patch up the wounded, but we don't have the strength to fight a war. Not yet." He clenched his good fist. "Men like dynamite, they think you win by breaking the enemy. But if you break everything, what's left? You just end up ruling over the rubble." "A valid point," Ida conceded. "But a shield cannot win a war on its own. It needs a spear." The conversation hung in the air, a foreshadowing of the internal conflict to come. The push and pull between caution and aggression, between sheltering the weak and fighting for a better world. For now, however, there was a truce. There was sanctuary. In the heart of a dystopian city, in a tomb of forgotten transit, a small group of anomalies had found a home. Izuku looked around at the faces, new and old. Uraraka, her warm presence a beacon of light. Ida, his stern logic a sharpening stone for their plans. Kirishima, their unbreakable shield. Tsu, their silent, watchful guardian. And Tensei, the symbol of their first true victory as a team. He was no longer just a boy hiding a power. He was the shepherd of a growing flock. And though the weight of their lives rested heavily on his shoulders, for the first time, he didn't feel entirely alone. The embers of a symbol, long hidden in his soul, were beginning to warm others, building a shelter against the encroaching cold.